Well, it doesn't get any easier. So thanks for being here. I might be losing people at this point. Okay. What have we looked at so far? Well, I started with the cosmic scale of our moral interconnectedness and its embeddedness in the order of created reality, right? That the moral and the natural order of things are bound up with one another. They're not separable. Right? And this led into discussions of the nature of virtue and vice and their habitual cultivation through our activities, right? Good or bad. Really presenting the goal of good character as preparatory for beatitude. That virtue is what makes you capable of sharing in the divine life. And we ended last week with the theological virtues as defining graced good character, right? So temperance, justice, fortitude, prudence, those are all moral virtues also, okay? But faith, hope, and charity are that, that glue of precious metal that puts the bowl back together, like in the kintsugi art form, right? So that's what we're after. Well, what must we cover next? Well, the next place I want to go, we went cosmic and then individual, and then I'd like to go back out again to the social. Understanding the social context of pursuing virtue. This will become obvious why we have to do this in just a moment. But this requires us, therefore, to be virtuous, but also to encourage virtue. And that's going to be the issue that we have to deal with today. Okay? A few items of housekeeping. Again, this is basically the same thing as last week. Just make sure, please, that if I'm asking you to fill out forms, you do them. Just helps a lot, if it's applicable to you. Okay? So you can check that out later. I don't need to go through all of this again. But yeah, sponsors still, part of the issue that I'm having right now is that a lot of energy is being taken up in these lectures, right or wrong, okay? We'll see if it's effective or not. But right now, I am having trouble keeping up with the logistics for trying to get sponsors for people. So I just want to remind everybody, okay, if you're an undergraduate, you really should be in a Bible study. And in that Bible study, you should be able to find a sponsor. So save us the trouble, please. If you're not, I know it's harder for you, okay? And so we are fielding people. We will connect you with them gradually and that sort of stuff, okay? All right. And then the documentation issue. If you have been baptized or think you've been baptized, we need proof of such in some form or another. And if there's any confusion about that, please reach out to me. But it's just a matter of finding where was I baptized and can they confirm it in somehow. And what we're looking for is confirmation of Trinitarian baptism. I baptize you in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, okay? Great, good. All right, let's move on. Okay, so first where I want to start with is the social context of beatitude. Okay, what does that mean? Well, beatitude is what we're aiming for, right? Life with God. Right. But we don't do that alone, okay? So just as a review, an important place to start with is talking about morality as obedience to natural law, right? That we can't separate the will of God from what he's designed a creation to be. Okay, so recall the definition of law from Aquinas. It's an ordinance of reason for the common good made by him who has care of the community and promulgated. Ordinance of reason being an important component there. Okay? And so natural law is a form of law that's embedded in creation, right? Through whom all things are made, Jesus Christ himself, right? The Son of God. And Aquinas puts it this way: since all things are subject to divine providence, are therefore ruled and measured by the eternal law. All things partake somewhat of the eternal law. That is, that's what gives them their being. And from the being imprinted on them, they derive their respective inclinations to their proper acts and ends. That is, I saw what did I see last week? I can't remember now. The groundhog or something? The groundhog, badger. Yes, the badger wants to eat whatever badgers eat. I guess field mice. Huh?
It was actually a groundhog.
Was it? Oh, okay. Well, that was a huge groundhog then, if that was the case. Okay. Anyways, it wants food, it seeks it. Those are its inclinations, right? Because it's got to survive, it's got to reproduce, on and on. The light of natural reason, whereby we discern what is good and what is evil, which is a function of the natural law, is nothing else than an imprint on us of the divine light, the rational creature's participation of the eternal law. All living beings have inclinations in accord with what they are, their nature. We as human beings, because we have rational souls, that's what sets us apart from animals, right? We have more inclinations than normal that have to do with our rational capacities, right? So that's kind of the idea there. And so virtue and vice can be defined accordingly. This is all review at this point, by the way. Okay. A good habit is one which disposes an act, what I do, suitable to the agent's nature, in accord with human nature. while an evil habit is that which disposes an act unsuitable to nature. Okay, when I have a vicious habit, right, I do things that are not in accord with what's good for me. Thus, acts of virtue are suitable to human nature since they are according to reason, whereas acts of vice are discordant from human nature since they are against reason. Hence, it is clear that habits are distinguished specifically by the difference of good and bad. Okay, so being in accord with nature is the same as being in accord with reason, on and on and on. Okay, and the Catechism indicates that this is accessible to all persons. And again, this is from the previous presentation, right? Quote from Cicero, pagan Roman philosopher, rhetorician, right? For there is a true law, right reason. It is in conformity with nature, bam. Is diffused amongst all men, universal, bam. And is immutable and eternal. Sounds like divine, right? Its orders summon to duty, you're required. Its prohibitions turn away from offense, right? So virtue and vice. To replace it with a contrary law is a sacrilege. We'll talk about that later on in this presentation. Failure to apply even one of its provisions is forbidden, and no one can abrogate it entirely, right? So you can damage people a lot so that they're not able to sense the natural law anymore, right? And that's terrible. That's a terrible violence on a person. But deep down within them, this is the Catholic optimism, I suppose, right? They still remain essentially human and therefore capable deep down of making some sort of choice for God, right? Even the most disturbed person, because everybody's looking for the good somehow, even most confusedly. So this is part of our hope for people in the world, okay? All right, so, but now we need to return to the structure of natural law, having thought about it, okay? And Aquinas offers a good structure here: self-preservation, self-propagation, self-promotion. That's the way that I've talked about it, right? All life forms strive to stay alive, all like reproduce in some form or another, but animals in particularly through sexual intercourse and raising offspring. And then, this is the rational part, right? Know the truth about God and live in society, okay? And so these precepts offer a structure for our own discussions, right? In accord with this diagram I have over here. We can talk about what's good for the individual, right? What is good for each human being, right? In accord with human nature, and then upon that, specifics having to do with who people, specific people are, right? We don't want to overgeneralize too much. But then we ask the question of society, right? And there are two considerations at the social level, see? How does society fulfill the human person directly? That is, why do we need to live in society, right? And then how must society support fulfillment indirectly? And that'll take up much more of our content for today, okay? And then finally, family. What is the role of family as an intermediary? And that's going to become much more important in the next presentation, especially when it comes to situations surrounding marriage, family, and sexuality, okay? So stay tuned for that. All right, good. So the first society question is easily answered. What is that? How does society fulfill the human person directly? Okay, we're talking about fulfilling human nature and our social dimension in all of this. Okay, well that's easily answered actually. Okay, let's just go right to the gospel. Luke's gospel, Luke's version of the same passage. It's in all the synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. But there's this back and forth between Jesus and an expert in the law. Okay, the lawyer says, "Teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life?" And Jesus responds, "What is written in the law? What do you read there?" And the lawyer says, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself." Okay? And Jesus says, "You have given the right answer. Do this, and you will live." Okay? Or we can go to the Apostle John later. "Beloved, let us love one another, because love is from God. Everyone who loves is born of God and knows God. Whoever does not love does not know God, for God is love." Okay, so love, 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 love. Not L-U-V, capital L-O-V-E, right? That's what we're after. So love is the goal of Christian morality. That's what I was basically arguing last week, okay? And this is virtue, the theological virtue. God giving me the ability to love, okay? Not just affection, not just good feelings and being nice and all this other stuff, okay? No, genuine love. And we'll trip across exactly what that means later on when we're looking at Aquinas, okay? And this is what makes us participants of the divine nature. Again, if God is love, therefore we must become loving in a human graced way, right, in order to participate in the divine nature. So that's the idea there, okay? And so when you think about this, the realization of love is impossible without social life, okay? This is why we need people. You cannot love your neighbor without neighbors. So if you're isolating yourself, you are actually impacting your own well-being, okay? And this echoes the third precept that Aquinas talks about in the natural law and its connection between God and society, okay? Specifically, I've alluded to this, but this is exactly what he says. Okay, man has a natural inclination to know the truth about God and to live in society. Okay, whatever pertains to this inclination belongs to the natural law. Note, to know the truth about God. That's kind of interesting. Okay, so the pursuit of truth is inherently the pursuit of God, actually. Okay, so this is a general inclination within the rational, because of the rational soul. Okay. For instance, what belongs to the natural law? To shun ignorance, to avoid offending those whom one has to live, and other such things regarding the above inclination. Okay, so this is what it means to live in society, to pursue truth, on and on. Okay, and funny enough, right, in the Christian dispensation of grace, imperfections in society are now even occasions for grace. Right, Jesus teaches, Gospel of Matthew during the Sermon on the Mount. If you love those who love you, what recompense will you have? Okay? And if you greet your brothers only, what is unusual about that? Do not the pagans do the same? So be perfect, just as your heavenly Father is perfect. Okay. Therefore, this is where the great love commandment of not just loving God and neighbor, but loving your enemies even, right? This is the radicalness of the theological virtue of love. Okay. All right, but we have to be careful here, okay? Because love is never, ever, ever going to be contrary to justice. And so we have to understand the role of justice in all of this, okay? The demands of natural law specifically concern justice. And this is what we're going to investigating more, okay? In a post-Christian world, and I guarantee you we are living in a post-Christian world, okay? Christian civilization is done, all right? It's our chance to rebuild, okay? Among ourselves, at least, okay? Love and justice tend to get confused, right? Whenever people are having conflict about this, that, and the other thing, I just invite you to consider, is this person talking about love or is he talking about justice, right? This is an important thing to be thinking about. Okay? Now, from the Christian point of view, love builds upon justice in the same way that grace builds upon nature, and you can't violate natural law while also thinking that you're in God's graces, okay? But love cannot be commanded. Love cannot be commanded. This is what Aquinas has to say, okay? According to Aristotle, not every love has the character of friendship. That's what gets at love, okay? But that love which is together with benevolence, when we love someone so as to wish good to him, that's the nature of friendship here, okay? And he later specifies, we might say that friendship is a moral virtue about works done in respect of another person, but under a different aspect from justice. Because justice is about works done in respect of another person under the aspect of legal due. That is, when I'm acting justly towards another person, it's because I'm obligated. Okay? Whereas friendship considers the aspect of a gratuitous favor, and in the Latin, beneficii gratuiti. Okay? And that word, gratus, right, is the same sort of root as grace. Okay? Favor, all these sorts of things, right? So this is the graciousness of friendship. That's the nature of love. It's very distinct from justice, though, which is what a person is absolutely due by justice, okay? And so grace begins by fulfilling justice, but then goes beyond into love, true Christian love, okay? And so this leads into the political context of morality. And I'm not talking about political in terms of partisan whatever, okay, or ideologies or anything like that. I'm trying to get at what does it mean to live in society and to contribute to civil life in a way that is civil, right, but also loving as a Christian. And so we have to start pondering, well, what have we been commanded, right, by God, but also by others as well, okay? And so some tricky questions come up when we start to consider all of this. Is secular ethics opposed to Christianity, Christian morality, and vice versa, or is there some way that they can overlap in a healthy way? Okay. A lot of people think Christians demand legal adherence to Christian dogmas. Okay. So when we're having conflicts in society over this, that, and the other thing, people are talking about, whatever. My karma ran over your dogma, right? Stay away from my own beliefs. Okay. But on the other hand, and these last two questions I'm not necessarily going to answer today, that's going to come up I think a bit more next week. Is secular ethics inherently neutral or a-religious? Just a hint, I would say no. Okay, so but more next week. On what basis shall we make law at all? Can science tell us what is good or bad? Right? With a capital S. Even, okay. Well, to begin our considerations, primarily the first question there, let's consider Aquinas when he's talking about sacred doctrine. Okay, this is the very first question that he talks about in his famous work, the Summa Theologiae. Okay, and he has this to say: even as regards those truths about God which human reason could have discovered. Okay? This is why Aristotle and Plato were able to reason their way up to there being one God. It was necessary that man should be taught by divine revelation, because they would only be known, these truths, by a few, and after a long time, and with the admixture of many errors, okay, such as polytheism. But man's whole salvation, which is in God, depends upon the knowledge of this truth. Therefore, in order that the salvation of men might be brought about more fittingly, or fitly, and more surely, it was necessary that they should be taught divine truths by divine revelation. Okay? So what Aquinas is saying here is that there are many things that we can know about the world and about God that do not require divine revelation. Okay? But if God wants to reveal the things that are necessary to know that could be reached by natural reason, what he wants to do is he wants to make these as broadly available as possible. Okay? He doesn't want you to have to be a super genius to try to figure out whether there's one God or not. Okay? And above all, nobody can figure out whether God is a Trinity, right? That has to be revealed. So that's interesting because this actually correlates well with how we can consider something like the Ten Commandments in the Old Testament, right? If we go to Exodus chapter 20, all right, this is a basic outline, okay? And you can take a look at that link there on Wikipedia. Very great article, actually. So people talk about the Ten Commandments, but actually when you like read Exodus 20 and later on in Deuteronomy and that sort of thing, it's actually kind of hard to like break them up into 10. Okay, so you got to fudge things a little bit, right? But 10 is a lovely number, and so people do this. But you can look at the different ways that people have broken this up within different, like Jewish and Christian traditions, and maybe even Islam. I don't know. Anyways, great article. Check it out later. It's very cool. But this is the basic Catholic outline here. Okay, so no other gods or idols, no misusing God's name, and keep holy the Sabbath. Okay, so that's to start. But then look, honor your father and mother. Don't kill. And by that Hebrew word, we mean murder, okay? Not, don't eat animals or something, okay? No, it's don't murder a person, which means killing an innocent person not in self-defense and so forth, okay? A lot of tricky parts with just war and all this sort of thing, but later. No adultery, no stealing, no bearing false witness, right? Don't lie on a court of law about somebody. And then the last two, don't covet another's wife, and don't covet another's goods, okay? But you notice, coveting is an inward movement. Well, we'll get to that in just a moment, okay? All right, well, you can go, and there are other ancient legal codes, some of which are even more ancient than Judaism, okay? Like the Code of Hammurabi, that seems to exist from 1750 BC onwards, okay? And none of these are applicable. Okay? All right. But these are. Trick here, interestingly enough, the Code of Hammurabi does not have a prohibition on killing in any directly way. However, if you go to the even older Code of Ur-Nammu, okay, from 2100 BC, it's explicitly, it's like the first thing it talks about, don't murder, right? And there's serious penalties for that, such as being executed, okay? All right, but we keep going on. I mean, Code of Hammurabi talks about all these things. Adultery, stealing, theft, offenses against administering law. But not these. Okay, it's not talking about inward movements of the heart. All right. Well, what do we do with all this? Well, clearly this is unique to the Jewish tradition. Okay, right here. However, this is not. But these are. So that's really interesting, I think. What is the significance of this? Well, the Ten Commandments, we can see, are heterogeneous. That is, there's many types of law within them, actually. Okay? When Aquinas is explaining the need for divine law, he points out this. He says, after the fall, our destiny is beyond this world, to God. And therefore, we need divine commandments that actually turn us towards Israel's God, right? And so that's the legitimacy of the Numbers 1 through 3, okay? That's the applicability of them. However, second, there must be no doubt about the natural law. And therefore, even in the Ten Commandments, there is, again, just as with theological truths, speculative truths, right, also moral truths. God condescends to tell us explicitly what we ought to know by human reason alone, but we won't necessarily, right? But I've just illustrated to you that they can be by just citing other non-Jewish legal codes, right, that well predate Christianity. So there's something common going on here. Third, We, as human beings, do not judge interior movements, such as coveting, right? And that's what concerns number 9 and number 10, which is interesting. Right? Fourth, human law has limits, but divine law does not. And we're going to talk about the limits of human law in just a moment, okay? In other words, there are certain things, like human law shouldn't be legislating with regards to my internal dispositions, right? But God ought to. He ought to tell me what is proper for my heart to be doing, right? So that's Aquinas' reasoning. Why do you need divine law also? Why is natural law and eternal law not enough? Okay, so that's the idea here. And so, like, the point I'm trying to make of this is that some Christian morality is properly religious, right? Numbers 1 through 3, okay, and Numbers 9 through 10, okay? But everything else concerns our neighbor. Don't kill, don't steal, don't commit adultery, all these things, okay? These are part of the natural law that even non-Jewish people could recognize, and certainly people well before Christ, okay? And so when Christians are engaged in the social realm, they're doing so according to what is right with regards to their neighbor, not with regards to God, okay? Indirectly with regards to God, right? But not directly. So we have no business telling people you must believe in the Trinity in order to live, right? That would be wrong. Okay? So there we go. All right. So here's what we can do with all of this, right? Clearly the first three have strictly to do with God and external acts, but also internal, right? Belief and that sort of thing, okay? Neighbor is 4 through 8 here, okay? Those are all part of external acts that are part of the natural law, okay? The last one concerns God, but also our neighbor, as I will point out later on. But these have to do with internal acts, and so these are not going to be legislatable, okay? Okay, so this leads into a discussion of political life. What's it about? Well, first of all, it's necessary. And this is something that I go on a lengthy rant on, and I'm not going to today, but this is really important to me, okay? Because if we follow Aristotle, and Aquinas does, he defined man as a political animal, okay? Political life, broadly speaking, okay, I'm not just talking about voting, but like you belonging to a fraternal organization, or you whatever, you know? I mean, there's lots of different ways that you can participate in civic life without it just being legislating and that sort of thing, right? But it all makes up law within society, okay? It makes society possible. And thus, for Aquinas, politics is not a necessary evil. Rather, it's part of what it means to be a human being. Puts it this way. When he considers whether or not there would have been government pre-sin, this is what he answers. A man is the master of a free subject, okay? Just as the governor of this state is a master of me as a free subject, right? He's governing. He's got the executive power and this sort of thing, right? By directing him either towards his proper welfare or towards the common good, right? Now, the governor might not show up at my home, right? But there are the police, okay? And they're under this great hierarchy of the state and so forth, okay? Or to the common good, right? So my individual proper welfare or the common good of the community. This is legitimate. This mastership would have existed in the state of innocence between man and man. First, because man is naturally a social being. Bam. But social life cannot exist amongst a number of people unless under the presidency of one to look after the common good. That's the buck's got to stop somewhere argument, right? And this is kind of similar to what I used with regards to the logic of what it means to be a Catholic, right? The buck has to stop somewhere. Otherwise, it's just interminable debate and division, okay? That's the idea here. Secondly, if one man surpassed another in knowledge and virtue, now I want to point out something here, okay? This is in a state of innocence, and there would be differences in knowledge and virtue. Isn't that interesting? In other words, just merely because you have different intellectual capacities, different moral capacities, different strengths, different weaknesses, and that sort of thing, right? That does not necessarily make it sinful. What this makes possible is for legitimate diversity amongst people in community without there being sin. Wow, right? We're not all meant to just be the same uniform, cookie-cutter person, right? Even pre-sin. So that's wonderful. This would not have been fitting unless these gifts conduce to the benefit of others. Why is there inequality in the world? Because it's supposed to benefit everybody else, okay? When it doesn't, something's gone wrong, okay? Inequality of gifts and dispositions and background and wealth and all this sort of thing. All those things are meant as an opportunity for me to serve others, not to benefit myself, okay? Hence Augustine, just men command not by the love of domineering, but by the service of counsel. That goes back to my distinction last week between tyranny and political government, right? The natural order of things requires this, and thus did God make man. This is by design. We're made for this. and it is not just a product of sin. So this is an important part of our life. However, there are limits, and we know this very well as United States citizens, right? Political life must be limited in order to be good. It cannot be unlimited. It will stretch beyond its bounds. First of all, law should avoid addressing exceptions. Okay, law is made for the common, not the exceptional. So, quoting from the I think Roman jurist Ulpian, laws should be made to suit the majority of instances, and they are not framed according to what may possibly happen in an individual case. You don't legislate to the individual, you legislate to the common society, right? And then he quotes later with Aristotle, in contingent matters such as natural and human things, it is enough to be for a thing to be certain as being true in the greater number of instances, though at all times, and less frequently it fail. Okay, so law is not meant to micromanage our life. It is meant to take care of what is ordinary. Okay, so that's an important limitation on all of this, first of all. Right, so basically that's helpful when talking about the common good, which we'll get to that. Law is very destructive then when it balkanizes society, that is, divides us up into little groups and makes different law for everybody, right? This is a huge problem maybe today. Okay, right. Okay, second, law does not seek to repress all vice. Now this is really interesting, and I hope you appreciate this. This is what Aquinas says. Human law is framed for a multitude of human beings, the majority of whom are not perfect in virtue. Wherefore, human laws do not forbid all vices. Okay? But only the more grievous vices from which it is possible for the majority to abstain, and chiefly those, notice, the prohibition of which human society could not be maintained, namely murder, theft, and such like. Where do we find murder and theft? That's fifth and seventh commandment, I think. Okay? All right. Third, law does not seek to encourage all virtue. Human law does not prescribe all the acts of every virtue, but only in regard to those that are ordainable to the common good. Okay? If you are commanded by society to do something like obey a traffic law, okay, done directly for the common good, or when citizens are directed to in the upholding of the common good of justice and peace, right? So law legitimately commands the good when it is for the sake of the common good, but not to dictate your life. You got to make your own decisions with regards to the good for you, okay? And that's the deeper thing going on here about not legislating to dispositions, but acts. Fourth, unjust law is no law at all. By the way, I don't even know how much of this is in our current understanding today as a society, but this passage is pretty much directly quoted by Martin Luther King Jr. in his letter from a Birmingham jail in order to legitimize his passive resistance. Okay? He quotes Augustine, he quotes Aquinas, and it all has to do with this very idea. Laws may be unjust in two ways. First, by being contrary to the human good. How do you know the human good? Natural law. Becoming like acts of violence rather than laws when this happens. Wherefore such laws do not bind in conscience. You are not bound to an unjust law in conscience. Okay? Second, through being opposed to the divine good, like laws of tyrants inducing to idolatry or anything else contrary to the divine law. And laws of this kind must in no wise be observed. By the way, this makes for a pretty good basis for religious freedom too, okay? Because if we want to be respected with this sort of thing, well, we want others to be respected for that too, especially when it comes to liberty of conscience, okay? All right, however, this is an important caveat in this, and it's going to become very important on the next slide, I think it is. Injustice does not per se counsel rebellion, okay? From right up here, okay, I cut this part out. Such unjust laws do not bind in conscience, except perhaps in order to avoid scandal or disturbance, okay? For which cause a man should even yield his right, okay? In other words, the social order can be worth preserving even in cases of severe injustice, right? It doesn't make it right, it just means that we have to be very careful about who and what makes the determinant about, we're just not going to follow this anymore, okay? Now, why that's important is because this gets at the necessity of the virtue of prudence. Okay. You can have a right, but you can still do wrong. Okay. Human law can fail with regards to matters of virtue and vice. Okay, we know this all the time. People themselves can fail in responding to legal failures. Why? Because they say this is an injustice and I'm going to do something about it, but in the meantime I'm damaging the social order, right? And so it's complicated. What do we do in such situations? Well, again, this is where questions of justice must turn to those of prudence. Understanding what is just is only the first step. The question is what you do about it, right? You're moving from the speculative to the practical at that point. And this is what Aquinas has to say here. It belongs to the ruling of prudence to decide in what manner and by what means. And how do you achieve the good? Man shall obtain the mean of reason in his deeds. That is, follow the natural law according to human reason. Through activities. Man directs himself by prudence, commonly so called, in relation to his own good, but by political prudence, of which we speak, he directs himself in relation to the common good. Okay? So prudence dictates discerning, what do I do about what's going on in society, amongst others, on and on, right? This is why we don't make laws for everything. Okay? We don't want to. We don't want to live in a society where this is necessary. Okay? But it can be very complex to track the mean therefore, right? The rational mean when it comes to discerning how do we participate in civic life? How do I think of myself as a member of a community and so forth? Okay? So I would love to do an entire presentation of just Catholic social teaching, but we're going to keep it very, very basic as to where to start. Okay? Because this gets at the idea of the common good. Okay? We have to make decisions with regards to the common good whenever we're thinking about ourselves being good. And this returns us back to the second social question, which has to do with what is the role of society in making sure that I have a place in which I can pursue the good, and therefore that others can too. Okay? We can just look back at Genesis chapter 4, okay, after Cain murders his brother Abel. There they are, already out of the garden, so forth, okay? But God asks, where is your brother Abel? Cain says, I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper? God replies, what have you done? Right? The answer is yes, you are your brother's keeper, okay? Catechism, 1905. In keeping with the social nature of man, the good of each individual is related to the common good, which in turn can be defined only in reference to the human person, okay? So what is the common good? It's what's good for the human person, okay? What's good for the human person? Well, it can be what's good for the common good, okay? The two are not necessarily, no, never in conflict, really, at least theoretically, okay? Practically, it can be very complex in terms of discerning what's going on here, okay? All right, next paragraph. By common good is to be understood the sum total of social conditions, okay, which allow people, either as groups or as individuals, to reach their fulfillment more fully and easily. It concerns the life of all. It calls for prudence, there we go, from each, and even more from those who exercise the office of authority, which is why I've been harping on law, right? Because we have to understand what is the purpose of law. It's for all of what's being described here, okay? All right, well, alternatively, and this is a very helpful metaphor for me, and a more recent one, this is introduced by Pope John Paul II around the time of the Catechism being written, so it didn't make its way into the Catechism, okay? This is in 1991, a lovely encyclical from Pope St. John Paul II. He says, we must also mention the more serious destruction of the human environment. Although people are rightly worried about preserving natural habitats, and he goes at length about, species going extinct and so forth, too little effort is made to safeguard the moral conditions for an authentic human ecology. That's what we're talking about when we talk about the human good, the social conditions for human thriving. Man must respect the natural and moral structure, see? Order of nature, order of morality, with which he has been endowed. Man receives from God his essential dignity and capacity to transcend every social order. So we don't use the social order as an excuse to be bad, okay? Like we can overcome the temptations that society puts upon us. But he is also conditioned by the social structure in which he lives, okay? This is why a person can not have a clear understanding of what right and wrong is, okay? That we get cultivated by everybody else around us. This can either help or hinder his living in accordance with the truth. The decisions which create a human environment can give rise to specific structures of sin which impede its full realization. In other words, we can be so embedded in ways of thinking, cultural, political, social, just all sorts of stuff going on, right? Where our minds and our hearts get distorted. And that's what we don't want. In the same way that we don't want pollution, right, within a nice little environment because we're all connected here, right? So this idea of human ecology is a great way to understand the common good. We want to create an environment for ourselves individually, and we have a responsibility to do that, right? But we also have to take a realistic view of the wider shape of the communities that we live in, right? Now, that doesn't mean that we have a right to everything that we want, okay? We just got to live our lives, okay? We can't rely on just constant political action to make everything right, okay? That's not what we're about. But we do have to ask the question, especially when we are calling others to virtue. What are we doing to make it more possible for them to pursue virtue? And that's where we're going with this, okay? So what are we seeking as the common good then? Well, you can go to the Catechism, 1907 through 1909, that discusses three elements. First, respect for the person, and this comes right from the idea of the human being made in the image and likeness of God, right? This is respect for rights, freedom to pursue flourishing, and it includes even privacy and rightful freedom in religion. There you go. Okay, these things are necessary for us to thrive properly. It also includes social well-being and development. That is, accessibility to what is needed for holistic flourishing. Now, you can try to get those things in a variety of ways. Okay, there's no one way to solve these problems. Healthcare, food, okay? This is why we have to participate in political life. We've got to work this out with one another. How do we provide for one another's well-being, even with regards to temporal matters, okay? And but of course, this requires proper personal responsibility, okay? So it's not what can I give, what can I take, but also what am I giving, right, in accord with what I have. So that's the idea there. All right, third, peace, or stability and security of a just order, okay? So individual protection, right, self-defense, but also national self-defense as well, right? This is the basis for there being self-defense at all, right, whether at the corporate or the individual level. But that does not mean, beyond a legitimate self-defense, that we don't have a wider worldview, a universal common good of the whole human race that we need to care for too. And so you see how this plays in some of our political debates that we're having today, right? How do we actually achieve these things? Well, these are kind of the goals, but again, prudence dictates how we achieve justice and peace. So people are going to disagree, and it's okay to disagree. What's hard is when we disagree on what's good. Then you don't even know where to start, right? You can't even begin to discuss how do we achieve the good if you can't agree on what's good, okay? Now, what does all of what I'm going through help with? Well, in my opinion, this, okay? First, if we look at commandments number 1 through 3, again, the 10 commandments, all those have to do with God. Now, we know from human history, especially the history of the church, confessional states are allowable, okay? I think, is it Luxembourg? I forget where, but there's a few, like, old European countries that still have, like, Catholic doctrine in their constitutions, right? And support for the Catholic Church and that sort of thing. It's allowable. However, the Catholic experience of the United States and greater religious freedom and that sort of thing says it's not necessary, okay? In that sense, we're apolitical, okay? We do not require a particular circumstance in order to thrive as Christians. We can't demand that of everybody else, okay? And therefore, Christians do not seek to impose religious dogma. If we ever did, that would be wrong, okay? Now, a community can come together and they can say, we all believe this, and so let's make this, but that's not the same as imposition, you see, for like a minority group to like say, okay, all y'all, we're going to dictate what's true, okay? All right, second, commandments number 4 through 8 all have to do with our neighbor, okay? And so all humans have access to and can obey natural law. We start with that. Okay? Natural law is the minimum basis of a just human law, and therefore, if something is contrary to natural law, it becomes unjust. And law concerns activities, above all those which are most grave, and we'll be going towards that next. Commandments number 9 through 10 have to do with God and neighbor, as I've hinted at previously. Because though law cannot dictate to the inner person directly, we do have to be concerned about the inner life in such a way that law can legitimately protect the inner lives of persons. Okay? That is, we don't let people just be exposed to anything, especially children. Okay? Those sorts of limits are breaking down today, and people are getting a little disturbed by that, and rightly so. Okay. And so to finish up, I want to go back to this topic of gravity and the common good. Okay. Returning to the definition of mortal sin from the previous week, there were 3 qualifications for something to be mortal sin. That is, to kill the life of charity within yourself. Okay. It has to be grave. You have to have full knowledge and full consent of the will. Full knowledge and full consent of the will are the tricky parts, especially the will, okay, when it comes to the life of the passions, deeply ingrained habits of thought and feeling and this sort of thing, okay? But this is what the Catechism then says about this idea of grave matter. Grave matter is specified by the 10 Commandments, okay, which is why I've been reviewing them. Corresponding to the answer of Jesus to the rich young man. It's exactly what I quoted earlier. Do not kill, do not commit adultery, do not steal, do not bear false witness, do not defraud, honor your father and mother. Yeah. The gravity of sins is more or less great. Stealing a paper clip is not the same as killing your neighbor. Okay? I mean, that should be pretty easy to find out. But why are these both grave then? Okay? One must also take into account who is wronged. Violence against parents is in itself graver than violence against a stranger. Okay? So that you see there's a lot of qualifications here, which is interesting when we're talking about something being grave. And this will come up again when we're talking about the sacrament of confession later, but that's going to have to wait. Okay? What I want to offer to you, this is my opinion. Okay? At this point, I have to say, this is my opinion about how to interpret all this. And I hinted at this last week. I think the best way to talk about gravity is as matters of life and death, more or less. Okay? Commandments 1 through 3 and 9 through 10 are about spiritual life and death. Commandments 4 through 8, individual and social life and death. And let me explain what I mean by this. Okay? Don't kill is the most obvious. Just don't kill. Okay? That's pretty obvious as a matter of life and death. Okay? So we don't need to go too much into that. But what about all the rest? Well, I think that they too, in a way, can be considered matters of life and death too. For instance, honor your parents. What is this about? Well, securing intergenerational integrity. That from one generation to the next, there is care, there is love, there's responsibility, all these sorts of things that we find, for instance, in older cultures that haven't been influenced by Western individualism, right? You see this as a natural part of just this intergenerational growth. And this is why, we'll talk about family next week, and I'll bring this up again, but, the church's vision of the family is not the isolated nuclear family cut off from everybody else, right? No, it's thick, right? Family and friends, extended generations, all this sort of stuff, right? Everybody's supporting one another. That's family, okay? So we're not after some sort of weird, isolated whatever. Okay, good. No adultery. Well, what does this do? Secures marriage and family stability. Who's that good for? Well, for the spouses, for sure, but especially good for the children. Okay? And that's going to come up next week a lot. No stealing. It secures the means of supporting life. If people are stealing from you, how can you take care of yourself? This is the legitimacy of property, right? Property is not absolute, but it is something that is derived from the natural law very immediately, right? People have to have a means of supporting themselves. They have a right to that. Okay, no bearing false witness. What does this do? Well, it secures personal justice and your reputation in the midst of a community. And if you need to live in society to thrive, and you do by nature, well, then anybody who's impacting your ability to live in society peacefully, that's threatening your life. Okay? So, each of these regards individual and social well-being is what I'm trying to make the point of. Okay? And to not protect these, this is the most obvious point, is to doom society, okay? And therefore to doom individuals as well. And that's what it means that they're life and death. Going back to an earlier quote, human laws do not forbid all vices, but chiefly those, the prohibition of which human society cannot be maintained. That's the concern with grave sin. It is something that's afflicting not only my soul, not only this person that I directly harmed, but it has some connection to the wider flourishing of society that I'm responsible for. And this, again, going back to our cosmic vision, right? The moral and the natural and the moral order are so interconnected that when I do something, it's going to have an effect. Okay? And so we can make important conclusions from all of this. First, you need a virtuous society, or at least a sufficiently virtuous society, to thrive morally. Okay? Going back to JP2's earlier writing, man is conditioned by the social structure in which he lives. This can either help or hinder his living in accordance with the truth. The decisions which create a human environment can give rise to specific structures of sin which impede its full realization. You have a right not to be impeded in the full realization of your human flourishing. Okay? That's the idea here. And insofar as that's impacted, well, an injustice is taking place. But again, prudence, what do you do about it? That's a different question. Okay, if you ever wanted to check out Catholic social teaching in a more systematic way, there's this wonderful compendium of the social doctrine of the Catholic Church that I linked to here. We'll be reviewing it next week, especially, but this is what it says about the common good. The common good indicates, there's the quote again, the sum total of social conditions which allow people, either as groups or as individuals, to reach their fulfillment more fully and more easily. Well, now that's interesting, more fully and more easily. What does that sound like? Well, just as the moral actions of an individual are accomplished in doing what is good, so that's the individual, so too the actions of a society attain their full stature when they bring about the common good. It, the common good, can be understood as the social and community dimension of the moral good. What does this mean? This means going all the way back to talking about the body of Christ, right? I brought up this idea of society as a body, right? The city as a body, the community as a body. Okay, well, what makes for a virtuous society? It's one in which the good is easy and enjoyable, right? That's what it means to be a virtuous society. What does it mean to be a vicious society? Very opposite of that, right? So this is the way that we can understand these sorts of things. Second, society needs a virtuous you to thrive morally, okay? And this is more applicable to us, just in our individual moral lives. Because your activities and my activities, indirectly and directly, shape the habits of society. Again, if we think of the body politic, right? Society is a body. Society has habits too. That's what JP2 is getting at with this idea of structures of sin. So as you participate in vice, for instance, the Overton window shifts. That is, public opinion shifts about what's right and wrong. And I'm a direct contributor to that insofar as I behave in such a way, right? If you want to go back to the gospel again, Sermon on the Mount, this is what Jesus says. Whoever breaks one of the least of these commandments, that is the one that he's going to be talking about in a moment, and teaches others to do the same will be called the least in the kingdom of heaven. We're all going to be ruled by the kingdom of heaven, by the way, but how we enjoy the kingdom of heaven is another matter altogether, okay? But what's he getting at here? The example you set, okay? What's the example you're setting for other people? That is important here. But further, the more that you participate in vice, or I participate in vice, the more others devote resources to helping you live viciously. This is the mistake that's been made in recent years, and we can debate this if you'd like, but with some of these drug legalization campaigns. In the legalization of pot growing in California, for instance, there was a wonderful expose in the Los Angeles Times that was pointing out that not only did that not get rid of the black market, it expanded the black market in drugs, okay? Well, why would that happen? Because you have more customers, okay? You have more customers now. And so you're not getting rid of the black market, you're expanding it, right? People will subvert the law. And the thing is, California, I don't know if they're still dealing with it, but I can't imagine they're not. They just simply don't have the resources to manage the levels of black market pot growing that's been going on ever since, okay? At least by the time I was reading that article. Okay? So again, as you do X, more people are going to say, a profit's being made by X. Interesting. Let's divert my capital into that, okay? Because your vice is my commercial interest. Right? This is how these sorts of things work. And in turn, what happens? The weight of society then shifts to make vice easier and virtue harder, therefore, okay? So what we do has a direct impact, not just through economics, right, but politics in general, that actually makes virtue harder for other people, okay? And that is an injustice. Further, your habits determine the probability of harms to others. And this is a little bit more experimental on my thought, but I think this is true. Okay. Remember, Commandments 9 through 10 on coveting. They're all about cultivating character. But it was about coveting other people's stuff. Okay. It regarded your neighbor, even though it's an internal thing going on. Now, admittedly, only God can judge the inner life. That's what Aquinas says, right? This is why you can't legislate against bad feelings, as it were. But nevertheless, the character that we have is going to have an effect on society eventually, okay? In other words, what you do in private will inevitably affect the public through how you behave, okay? And you can think that you can get away with this, okay? Oh, it's just my private vice or whatever, right? Or I'm just doing this in secret. This is in my own home or whatever. I guarantee it's going to come out eventually, okay? That you will have an effect on other people because of the character you're cultivating by what you do. That's going to be very relevant with some of the stuff that we have to talk about next week, okay? All right, so in conclusion, individual morality is intrinsically bound up with society, and that's my apologetic for today. This is what I've been trying to present to you, okay? The risk, I'll talk about that in a moment, if we don't acknowledge this, okay? But the point is that we owe it to others out of justice to actually cultivate virtuous lives, okay? We owe it to others in justice to be virtuous. Not only because of the direct impact we have on others, but the inevitable impact we will have through our actions later. And so by cultivating virtue, what we're aiming to do is to guard against our harming others directly and indirectly too. Okay? And we may demand the same of others. We have a right to that, but with prudence, right? Just because we have a right to something does not mean that we're going to demand it of other people, right? This is where we have to discern. Okay, and this will help us grapple with our topics next week. Punchline, all the controversial topics of life, sex, and death. So stay tuned. If you have a squeamish stomach, maybe you don't want to come. No, I'm kidding. I'm going to be very straightforward, but it's not going to be vulgar, and it's not going to be racy. Okay, so just be aware of that. Okay, but this, trigger warning. I don't know what to tell you. I'm going to be pretty straightforward on this stuff. Okay, because all these sorts of things have something to do with grave evil, and that's why we're concerned morally with these things. And everything I've built in terms of a framework is going to help you understand what? Why we must not dismiss these issues as merely religious, quote unquote, okay, which is what a lot of people have a tendency to do. But also that we not think of these issues individualistically, okay? So we're not after some sort of purity culture of this, that, and the other thing, okay? We're about understanding ourselves as thickly embedded with other people, and that's why the things we have to talk about next week are so important. Okay? They all concern love of God and neighbor. Those two things are inextricably bound up with one another, and so that's what we'll be moving on to next week, so stay tuned for that. All right. I haven't gone a full hour today. Great. Discussion questions. Insofar as you have time, these are just some ones that I'd offer to you. Okay. So what are your thoughts on the necessity of society to live a flourishing individual life? Can you be happy alone? But also, can you apply this to the idea of being part of a church? How about on distinguishing between matters concerning justice towards God and towards neighbor? How can we do that? How are they interrelated? How are they separate? Is there anything that you want to modify with what I've presented here? What do you think of casting personal morality as care for others? Right? Not just merely looking at myself, but the direct effects and indirect effects that I have on others through the character that I cultivate. And finally, what do you suspect we're building towards in the next talk? That would be interesting to know if you want to predict. Can you anticipate anything in advance? Can you put the pieces together to think about some of what we might talk about next week? So I will leave those for you to enjoy, insofar as you wish to enjoy them. And I'll be walking around if you have any questions. So, sayonara.